Sequence and selection. These are two basic principles of programming that you're going to need to get your head around. So first of all, sequence. When programming code executes, the sequence is the order of how the program flows. Each line of code needs to be in the right order for the program to work correctly. Each of these lines can be referred to as a statement. So a good definition of a statement is a single instruction or step within a program. We're going to have a look at an example of sequence working in a program, and then we'll have a look at a good definition. So I'm going to go to bb.net, and in here I've got a form with various buttons on there, and I've got this one called Calculate My Wages. If I double click on this, it takes me to the code for that button. I'm just going to put a breakpoint onto line 11 by clicking in the grey area on the side here. So when I run the program and double click on the button, the code is going to stop at this point, and we'll be able to follow it and see what it does. So I'm going to run the program. I'm going to click on the button, and that line turns yellow, which means it's stopped there. Before we hit F11 on the keyboard and start to work our way through the code, I've declared three variables here that's going to help me do my working out for my wages. The first one is DBL hours, and that's going to get set here by the value I'm going to put into an input box. So I'm going to press F11, and it comes up, how many hours did you work this week? 25. Okay, that. Now it's going to ask me for my rate of pay in another input box. So F11, and I get paid a hell of a lot of money, £1.50 an hour. So we OK that. Then it drops down onto a line to calculate how much that is. So it's the hours times the rate. So F11, I move on to the last line, which is actually just going to show it nicely formatted. It's £37.50, and F11, there we go, formatted nicely into pounds and pence. If things weren't in the right order here, then we wouldn't get the right data out. So if that line was above where I actually get my hours and my rate from the input boxes, then it wouldn't work it out properly. So things are going to be in the right order. So that's a good example of sequence. Definition of sequence. Sequence is a control structure where a set of instructions is each executed once. This is done in the order in which they are written. The next major construct we need to look at is selection. So a good definition of selection might be a control structure in which options of statements are provided, and a condition is used to decide which statement should be executed, if any at all. So an example might be the if statement. Now I've got a second button on my form which is going to calculate my wages, but this time it's going to consider whether I've qualified for overtime or not. So I've got a breakpoint on our first example of an if statement here. So the program's going to do the same before. It's going to retrieve my hours worked and my rate of pay using input boxes. But then it's going to decide, have I worked less than or equal to 35 hours, in which case I just get normal pay. Otherwise, if I've worked more than 35 hours, I qualify for overtime. So that calculation will factor in some overtime at time and a half, 1.5 there. So let's just run it and see that happen. So I'm going to think I'm going to qualify for some overtime here. So 40 hours. Okay, that. Still only getting paid at £1.50. Okay. So when it hits here and I hit F11, it's going to test 40 against 35. So it's actually going to jump down to the else, and it's going to pay me my overtime. Very nice too. So this is how the construct might look like. So if condition, then instructions to be executed if condition is true. Otherwise, instructions to be executed if condition is false. We saw an if-then-else statement. Sometimes you get the if-then statement, and that's when, if the condition is true, the next line is executed, but there is no alternative option. So it just basically would come out of the if statement if the condition is false. You don't need to do anything if the condition is false with that second box there. So, definition of if statement. If statements are a form of selection where a condition is used to determine the choice of statement to be executed. A condition is an expression that has a value of true or false. If true, then the next instruction is executed, otherwise a different instruction may be executed. There are things called nested if statements, where we can have an if statement, an if then else statement like the one in black there, but if the condition is true, then we might need to test something else. So we have a nested if statement in blue there, and you can nest as many as you like. It can get a bit messy to be able to read your code properly, but that is something that you can do. So an example might be if somebody does qualify for overtime, then they might get different rates of overtime depending on how long they've been with the company, for instance. So you need to do a second test. But that's just one example I've just made up on the spot. There are more meaningful examples. There's also something called the else if statement, and that would be that sort of construct. If condition is true, then instruction to be executed if condition is true. Else if condition, then instruction to be executed if condition is true. These last three should say true. That's a deliberate mistake. That's what would happen with the else if statement. It just does a check each time, which leads on nicely to what are called case statements. Case statements are a selection construct where a variable is tested instead of a condition. If the variable passes the test, then the next instruction will be executed. Otherwise, the variable passes through further tests and may execute a different instruction if it passes one of those tests. So that's a definition of a case statement, but I think it would be useful if you actually saw one happening. Here's a case statement, and what it's going to actually do is return a grade based on a score. So you could write this with an if then else statement. You could write it with else if statements, but the best way would be with this select case statement. So I'm going to put a breakpoint onto the earliest bit of code that I can. I'm going to run it. I'm going to click on the button. I'm going to watch what happens. So basically, it's going to ask me for a score. So I'm going to enter my score, which might be 75%. OK it, and then it's going to test out the score against these conditions. So is it less than 10? It's going to ask on this first line. It's not, so it goes and asks the next one. Is it less than 20? No. So it jumps onto less than 30, no. Less than 40, no. Less than 50, no. Less than 60, no. It's not less than 70 either. Is it less than 80? It is. So it drops down and it sets the grade. It will then display the grade, and there we go. Got an A. So that is the case statement. Bye for now.